but I can't welcome you here because I'm not from here. Instead, that's the task of this, the Centennial Pole, which is a Lummi welcome pole that was given to the city of Bellingham in 1953, carved in 1952, and it's called the Centennial Pole because it marks the 100th year anniversary of the event depicted at the bottom here. We see in the canoe with the paddles two Lummi leaders, Chawitsit and Selexwit, and we see two white guys, Henry Roeder and Russell Peabody. Roeder in front, Peabody in the back. What this event depicts is their arrival here as the first permanent white settlers along Bellingham Bay. And this pole, as a welcome pole, tells us a lot of things. It's not just a welcome mat that says, come on in. Instead, it tells us about Lummi Coast Salish people and about the way they lived here. And so we can see on this pole, which in this case is meant to be read from the bottom to the top and around the other side. At the bottom, the raven begins the stories, often the first bird to call in the morning and a very talkative bird. Above that, the bear, a really important teacher for people because the bear taught the people how to fish salmon. We're going to talk a lot more about salmon at a further stop down the way. Above that, we see the wolf who taught the people songs and dance. And we know it's the wolf. We can see the moon up there. We can also see on the moon a bug, a flea, and that tells us about the pestilence that had been amongst the Lummi people in the decades prior to Roeder and Peabody's arrival. And so for about 60 years prior to their arrival in 1852, white visitors from the Hudson's Bay Company, British Empire, Russian and Spanish empires, as well as American whalers had all visited and sent disease about Coast Salish people that had severely decimated their population. And unfortunately, as we'll see as we start kind of turning around the pole at the top, there were more threats and dangers to come. You see a serpent kind of looking creature at the top of the pole. And that creature there represents the danger, the threat that came in the wake of the arrival of these men. We can see that snake or that serpent is kind of wrapped around a series of reeds of cat and nine tails. And that's an important symbol there because it says that they're under threat, but they're brought together by this as well. And we know, well, some of us know that the cat and nine tails is a very enduring plant and endures through the winter out there in the water. It doesn't die and fall away. Much like the threat of colonialism brought together Lummi people and their traditions endure to this day. Below that we see a series of baskets. They represent the labors of Lummi women who threw a series of feasts down in Mukilteo in January 1855, not long after the arrival of these two men. And that was to celebrate or to mark the Treaty of Point Elliott, which is going to be a really important talk and a little further stop down. But that treaty is going to then bring an onrush of more and more Euro-Americans to this area. They're going to vastly and rapidly change the area. Below that we see the sundog, this kind of setting winter sun figure. It tells us when the treaty happened. And below that, a figure that, depending on whose story and whose kind of telling of this pole that you've heard, you might hear some different ways. This figure at the bottom, this kind of stylized figure, we see he has a drum and he has a series of kind of bone dice, right? And this is a bone dice game called Salhal. It's a Coast Salish game, goes back a long time. One version of the story would say that he represents that the people still had their traditions, they had games, they had song and dance amidst all this struggle and difficulty. Another interpretation says that we see the bone dice game being played because though this marks a certain history, the future, like any gambling game, is uncertain. So over the next about 90 minutes, I'm going to take us on a walk around the mouth of Whatcom Creek. We're going to talk a little bit more about the events kind of depicted here, as well as about focus on the following 50 years of the history of Bellingham and a little bit of Whatcom County. We'll have lots of stops. We'll take up a number of different topics, and there'll be chances to ask questions throughout. But before we move on to our next stops, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, so 1953, when the pole was commissioned,
Yeah.
how was the story told? And also, were the Lummi people asked to design and bring the pole, or did they offer it? I ask because I'm guessing that in 1953, parts of the story would not have been very welcome news.
Sure.
Many
So,
white people.
in 1953, when the story was told in the Cedar, and so the interpretations of the pole telling it in oral format come afterwards. Joe Hilaire, who was the Lummi carver who did this pole, was commissioned to do this work for the, was asked by the city to carve a pole to kind of represent a message from his people to the city. It was originally actually at the post. This isn't the original position. It was installed in here. It's been restored once. The two main versions, oral tellings of the interpretation or the story of the pole. It's not necessarily just interpretation. It's attempting to tell the story. Come from his daughter Pauline Hilaire, and then Felix Solomon, the carver, who restored it in 2007. Yeah, but Joe Hilaire, like a lot of carvers, his story was in the theater, and so he didn't necessarily give us a literal version of what this meant, and that's the way a lot of non-native artists also don't like to explain their work too much.
Yeah, no, I'm more interested in the story of how the pole came to be here.
Right.
And the relationship between the city and the Lummi Nation at the time.
Not very favorable, and we'll talk about a number of those kind of negative interactions, but hopefully this can be, this was intended to be by a number of people one step in evolving that relationship by sort of centering the Lummi people and their presence here first, which is what we're going to try to do. And I'll refer back to this a few times, the kind of message implicit in what we see at the bottom here, because again, this isn't just depicting events, it's providing us a lesson about them. And we can see that the two Lummi men have paddles and the two white men don't. And that's because these white men came here without knowledge of how to live here, right? And relied upon the generosity, the knowledge of these Lummi men. And they're only welcome to be here for as long as they're good passengers, as long as they didn't rock the boat too much. And so we want to think about this philosophy, this idea that for those of us who are non-native, we are here as visitors without a paddle, and that we have to accept that leadership and that knowledge, and that the direction should be set by native people who are here first and know this land best. So we're gonna walk along. We will cross a couple busy streets, and so I want everybody to be aware when we're doing that. And so one of the first things we're going to do is cross DuPont. It would ruin the tour forever if anybody ever got hurt on it. So please don't get hit by a car. That is my primary worry for your safety out there, okay? So we'll head to our first stop. So, as hard as it may be to believe, up until 1911, this was the shoreline of Bellingham. So that whole area down there, Maritime Heritage Park, was all a big tidal flat until the Whatcom Creek waterway was dredged. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later down the road. For now, the question is, why do Roeder and Peabody come to this area? They came here for the waterfall. They came up from San Francisco in search of a place known as Whatcom, which in the local Lak'temish language meant place of noisy waters. So I said out on the bridge, we gotta go somewhere less noisy for this time. So Rotor and Peabody were looking to build a sawmill, and the waterfall would power that. They negotiated with Chowitsit and Selexwit to get access to what was most likely a former village site on which a group of Lummi men were paid to construct a sawmill powered by that creek. The question is then, we should ask, and isn't always asked, why were the Lummi people here? Well, they were also here for the creek, because for this whole area of the Salish Sea, Coast Salish people lived along the creeks and streams where they would gather every fall and winter to get the salmon run. We'll get into a little environmental knowledge here, right? Salmon are a really crucial resource here. In the Pacific Northwest, we have plentiful rainfall, we have plentiful sunshine, but the main limiter to growth is a substance called nitrogen. There's a lot of nitrogen out in the sea, not much in the land. But salmon are thankfully born in freshwater streams and then spend their lives out at sea, eating little creatures and growing fat on that marine nitrogen. And then when they're mature, they return to the stream or creek or river in which they were born, and they go back to spawn. After they spawn, their body would be washed back out to the sea unless some enterprising mammal is there to scoop them up. Bear do this, otter do this, wolves, other creatures do this. Once humans start doing it though, right, it creates this symbiotic relationship because the humans living along the banks and relying upon those salmon are then depositing that marine nitrogen on the banks, which makes for healthy banks, wooded banks, and that's where salmon like to spawn. So the salmon keep coming back every winter, year after year. So every creek and stream on which the salmon ran were really crucial and were the winter home for a band of Coast Salish people. The Lummi people would often spend their summers out in what are now called the San Juan Islands before returning here right around this time of year as the salmon start to run in the creeks. The population stress of those introduced European diseases, though, had probably made it so that they had concentrated in fewer sites by the time these men show up in the 1850s. So they build the mill here and begin this process of killing Whatcom Creek, because the creek is going to become more and more industrial and have more and more initially sawdust and then sewage and other pollutants dumped into it. The creek is also changed by making it so that there's a big drop to turn the water wheel on the mill, and so that the salmon can't run up the creek anymore. This process is exacerbated by the construction of culverts when roads are put over. And so those salmon have returned to a somewhat restored mouth of Whatcom Creek. Now that there is a salmon hatchery here, they can't get all the way up because of the series of culverts and other impassable barriers. Just in the past year, there has been an order that's come down through the courts to disassemble these culverts, but it's a very slow process because none of the organizations responsible for the culverts really have the funds to do this. It is an unfunded mandate from the courts, and also because there's a lot of resistance to all the big changes that would have to happen. Even removing one or two culverts off of Whatcom Creek isn't going to help anything. You have to clear the entire path of every single one of them. And so it's going to be a slow process, but it's a process that needs to happen in order to bring salmon back to more creeks and rivers around the Salish Sea, which will also help save our endangered orca population. We're gonna continue on, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about the 1850s at a few sites over on the other side of things in Old Town. Before we go, do we have questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that the Lummi men that built the sawmill were paid.
Yes.
What currency were they paid in?
Well, they were not, for the building, they were not paid in currency. They were paid in a number of different things, most likely a number of different gifts, but the main sum of the payment was in blankets. In this area at the time, the primary kind of instrument of exchange were the blankets that the Hudson's Bay Company made, and they were kind of a standardized measurement of value. I'm not going to get the number right if I tell you, but they were paid a sum of blankets. Again, it might have been literal, or it might have been some other trade goods that were of equivalent value. All right, so we're going to walk along. Yes. Oh, sure. The question was, what were the Lummi men paid in? And so the Lummi were not paid directly for the land. There was no exchange of deeds or anything like that. They negotiated for that access and didn't pay for it, but the labor was paid for to build the initial sawmill. All right, so we're going to walk a little bit up DuPont. It's not necessarily the most scenic stretch of the walk, right? But as we do, take a look down at Maritime Heritage Park and know that that whole area about 100 years ago was all a tidal flat. And then for most of the 20th century, it was a sewage treatment plant and the city dump. And so it is an enormous aesthetic improvement that it's undergone in recent decades. It was not a very scenic walk, but I will say this is my favorite view in the city of Bellingham. Please be careful with the ford that is across here. It is pretty low, but it can be visually tricky, and I would hate for somebody to trip over it. So please be careful. And you can feel free to wander a little bit, but I will say a lot of people walk their dogs here and are not necessarily diligent about picking up. So just be careful if you get into the tall grass. We're standing here on a site that's part of Maritime Heritage Park, and some people call it Peabody Bluff. It became a very important site in 1856. When the U.S. military selected it as a site on which to build a blockhouse. Remember I told you back at the first poll, 1855, the Treaty of Point Elliott is signed. The U.S. military came in 1856 to enforce two important provisions of that. One, the Treaty of Point Elliott said that all native people living south of the 49th parallel were now under charge of U.S. Indian agents. And any living north of that were under the charge of the Hudson's Bay Company. They were in the British Empire, what would eventually become Canada. Except that line was cooked up thousands of miles from here, and no one knew exactly where it lies. And so a boundary commission was established, and at Semiahmoo, British and American officials met up and began to survey where the 49th parallel lay, and on which side different individuals who had lived here long before this border idea was cooked up, which side they belonged on. The other important part, and one of the main reasons the Army lands here, is because the Treaty of Point Elliott said that Lummi people had to confine themselves to their reservation. Right? So really quickly, right? 1852, Roeder and Peabody negotiate for access to a little rectangle of land, and everything else you see is Coast Salish territory. But in 1855, this treaty flips the script. It says, no, Lummi people, you have a small rectangle over there, and everything you see is open up to settlement. And anybody who is white, male, and here can take 120 acres, 160 acres, 320 if he's married. And so we start to
Offer
see...
him.
Offer him. We start to see an onrush. in August 1856, Captain George Pickett and a company of the 9th Infantry arrive at Maria Roberts' farm over on the eastern side of Bellingham, right at the mouth of the Nooksack River, the edge of the reservation. And they tell the very pregnant Mrs. Roberts that she has to go because the federal government has claimed her homestead and is taking it over for a fort. They came further up the road, and here they built their blockhouse. You can see it's obviously a nice natural rise for a little bit of a watchtower. The blockhouse was also the first house of incarceration here in Whatcom County. It was a place where, for the most part, most of the people incarcerated in it were deserters from the U.S. Army. Okay, almost a third of the men that Pickett landed with deserted at some point in their time here. Most of them were really freshly arrived Irish immigrants who had been scooped up and conscripted in the U.S. Army and then sent out here. In 1859, as a product of that border dispute, the U.S. Army kidnapped a Nooksack headman who they said belonged on the northern side of the border, wasn't American, he was British, or he was a British subject, and they incarcerated him here up until the point that the blockhouse gets deconstructed a little later in 1860. We'll talk about what happened with that across the street.
Is a blockhouse something? Is there a definition of a blockhouse?
Yeah, so a blockhouse is it essentially is a cube of logs that's built to be secure, and then a tower is put atop of it. And so it was, and I would not necessarily say it has anything to do with that square carved area like that, but because this area was kind of regraded and there was a barn on it for a long time. But sitting right in the middle of this, there would have been kind of a stout log cabin with then a watchtower on top of it. So we're seeing, right, very quickly that as Americans arrive here, they begin to really seize the paddle, to not be good passengers. And when we go across the street, we're going to talk about one particular significant character in this. That would be George Pickett. And we have some more people joining us. Hey, welcome. So we're going to head across the street here. I will warn everyone, be careful about the cord again. And we're going to go across the street and up the hill a little bit. The sidewalks are not so useful in this part of town because of all the regrading. This building in its original place in all of Washington State, not just Whatcom County, but all of Washington State. In 1856, a cabin was constructed here for George Pickett and his new wife, and eventually his new son. Up at Semiahmoo, where that border commission met, they had a conference where all of these U.S. officials and British officials met with native people from up and down the northwest coast to divvy up who they thought belonged on which side of the border, right? The border is going to cut right through the Lochtemish speaking Northern Straits Salish people who are the ancestors of today's Lummi, as well as of Esquimalt and Songhees people who live over in what's now Victoria, BC. They tended to be one group together in the islands in the summer, and then during the fall and the winter for the runs, head to their respective mainlands, to the creeks and streams for that run, but the border now divided them. At that conference, whether because they were love-struck or whether it was to secure some sort of alliance, Pickett married a Haida woman from the northern coast, from what's now BC, or what's now Haida Gwaii. She was named Sakis Tingong, translated as Morning Mist, and soon after bore him a son in December 1857. Jimmy Pickett would come to spend a lot more time in the Northwest than his father. Jimmy's mother died soon after childbirth. His father took a leave of absence to Virginia, and soon after his return, the 9th Infantry packed up both the blockhouse and Fort Bellingham and brought their supplies to the San Juan Islands, where a growing conflict called the Pig War with the Hudson's Bay Company led them to mostly abandon this post. Soon after, in 1861, George Pickett would resign his commission in the U.S. Army and return to Virginia, where he was born, to fight for the Confederacy and the lost cause of white supremacy. He did not bring his mixed-race son with him, instead leaving him in the care of another family of Virginia slaveholders who had moved out here. George Pickett goes on to be a hero of that lost cause, of the people who attempt to redeem the cause of the Confederacy and try to sanitize that legacy and make heroes out of these men who famously Pickett leads this bloody charge and failed charge at Gettysburg. Jimmy Pickett, on the other hand, is a much more interesting figure, and one that a building like this could really retain the memory of much more strongly. Jimmy Pickett, unlike his father, lived his whole life in the Pacific Northwest. He painted a number of scenes of these hills, as well as a painting of Mount Hood that hangs down in Olympia in the Capitol Gallery. When his father died in 1875, he fought a legal battle with his father's widow to gain ownership of this home, as well as some of his father's possessions, right? So George Pickett abandoned this home and abandoned his family here. Jimmy Pickett fought for it. Unfortunately, this building is still the George Pickett Memorial House. It is a Confederate memorial in 2018 in Washington State. But it's changed before. The building originally had a Douglas fir foundation, and it was jacked up and given a modern foundation. The porch, as well as the kitchen and bathroom that are in that addition on the left, are also not original, right? We're not looking at a pure 1856 log cabin here. So there's a lot of potential to change this site, save it from itself, and think about reorienting it around somebody who really wanted to be here in the Northwest and tells us a much more compelling and laudable story about it. Any questions before we move on to our next stop?
Is that a city building?
No, it's privately owned by the Daughters of the Washington Pioneers.
Did somebody mark out the George part on the Pickett sign? Did somebody white out the George?
It would seem that has recently been done. I hadn't even noticed that. Yes, so I believe that's recently been done. You can still see the stone has that, but yeah, I actually had not noticed that yet. So we learn something new every day.
Talk a little bit about slavery in the Washington Territory.
Well, so Jimmy Pickett, his legal name is James Tilton Pickett, and he's named after the Tiltons, a family of Virginians who have the kind of infamous honor of being the first slaveholders in Washington Territory. They brought an enslaved man with them to Olympia when they moved, even though the territory was not a slave territory. That man somewhat famously was helped by a group of abolitionists and escaped to Victoria, where there was a big abolitionist community, but the Tiltons remained very prominent sort of leaders here. A lot of the initial settlers up here in Whatcom County were of Southern extraction. Famously, the kind of Pickett's rival in the U.S. Army at the time felt like he got maneuvered out by all of these Southerners conspiring against him. So the local Indian agent, Edmund Fitzhugh, a number of other officials in the area were all former slave owners and were from slave-owning families. They came out here and they expressed a lot of the same attitudes towards indigenous people and attempted in a lot of ways to really, treat them like slaves. A lot will be made if you happen to take a tour in here of the idea that Northwest Coast people, particularly the ones who live north of here, were exceptionally brutal, savage, and slave-owning, slave-trading sort of people. The system of slavery on the Northwest Coast was vastly different than the transatlantic slave trade. It was a system that one really picked up only after all this population stress from disease and all of these kind of rapid changes from colonialism. Additionally, the system of slavery that was practiced, or the version of slavery that was practiced by, say, the Haida or the Tsimshian people, was non-transferable. So the enslaved woman gave birth, the child was not enslaved. Whereas in the U.S. tradition, you follow the womb, and so the children of enslaved women were always enslaved. Does that maybe get it?
So, no evidence of whites coming from the South and having slaves here?
In Whatcom County, no, not really, not that I know of.
But the broader territory.
But yes, in the broader territory. So by the time the Tiltons came up here, their slave had already, the man they brought with them already escaped. There are definitely a few, one of the things was at this time, a black person was so conspicuous here that normally, and I'm sure you know that today that can still be the way, but especially then, it was so conspicuous that for the most part, there are a lot of mentions anytime a black person shows up. And so, it's not so likely, but it definitely could have happened for a little while. So, we were just at the oldest building in its original location in Washington State. Pretty significant. This is also pretty significant. It's the oldest brick building in all of Washington State. Okay, and so oldest building in its original location, 1856. Oldest brick building in Washington State. This is built in 1858, 2 years later. It is built as a fireproof warehouse by a merchant named Richardson. And it was built during the first boom in what was the village of Whatcom. The village of Whatcom, remember, named after that little waterfall there, Whatcom in Laktemish. It became the site of this boom around the Fraser Canyon Gold Rush. The Fraser Canyon, way up there in BC. Fastest way to get there in 1858 was to take a boat right up to the dock here. Remember, we're down now in the tidal flat area. That hill was the shoreline. You would come here and you could camp for a couple days, and that whole hill was covered in white tents from the thousands of miners that showed up. There were only 600 people living in Whatcom, and 30,000 miners showed up that summer. Incredible rush of people. They would take what was known as the Nooksack Trail, roughly what goes along today's Mount Baker Highway, take that to the Sumas Trail. The Sumas are another tribe up along the border there, and you could take that up to the Fraser River, and then take that to the gold fields. That boom very quickly turns to bust that same summer, though, when the British government says, no, every miner arriving at the gold fields needs a permit that they pick up in Victoria. And so Victoria becomes the new boom town. And Vancouver also booms because you have to land in Victoria and then take another boat to the mouth of the Fraser, where the city of Vancouver now sits. Richardson has then got a very expensive warehouse and nothing to put in it. So he becomes the first, though not the last, Whatcom County businessman to seek a government bailout. And he gets the territory to buy his warehouse and turn it into the courthouse. It then becomes the seat of law. It becomes the place where trials are held and where, on occasion, in the basement, prisoners are held. This building then goes through a number of iterations after that. It's the courthouse, the seat of law, for a number of decades, as this area grows quite slowly. After that 1858 boom and bust, the Civil War soon comes and really slows down any new arrivals and any economic activity here. The mill that Roeder and Peabody had built burns down, and it burns while soon before Russell dies, and his kids can't agree over exactly how to deal with it. So his property is all locked up in probate for a number of years. And things are very slow here in a number of ways. This building eventually gets passed on. It's bought by a taxidermist, Carl Akers, who erected this historical marker. There are some questionable assertions here, namely the idea that the bricks were made in Philadelphia. Somebody did a contemporary mass spectrometer analysis, and they're pretty sure that the bricks, like all of the old brick in the Northwest, came from the San Francisco brickyards. There's no need to ship them around from Cape Horn, but still, Akers is the one who built the wooden kind of top to this. You can see his name still along the side if the trash isn't piled too high. He then rented it out to a number of tenants. It was home to the Northwest Passage, a radical newspaper here in the late 60s and early 70s. A number of different tenants, many of whom have noted the issue with this building. And it's that it was initially constructed on a series of wooden piers to have a dock on the side, and boats could come right up to it. Then the street level was raised. When the waterway was dredged, they brought the street up. You can see right here the old skylights for the vault underneath. And you can see that this doorway is actually an old second-story window that was then cut down to make the new entryway when the street level was raised up. But when the tide is big and the weather is wet, which happens in Whatcom County, the basement still floods. The Historical Society owned this for about a decade, but they found that it's under attack from water, from below, from the top, and they didn't have the money to make the improvements. And so it's recently been sold to a private owner who's a member of the Historical Society and is interested in preserving the site. And they're trying to figure out how to make it work and preserve this piece of history. You'll see as we go by that there's a number of abatements that have been done to try to protect it some from the water, but it is a real challenge, as I said, under attack from the rain and the tide. Any questions before we turn the corner?
Is that rent me sign true? Can you
Yes,
rent this?
you can rent it for events. And so for a little while, the Historical Society was renting it out. Then the flood came and ruined the floor. The floor is fixed again. The new owner is renting it out for events. And so it is a very interesting building, a lot of stories, a lot of history. Right, I know. Being surrounded by the recycling plant is not super aesthetically pleasing and kind of detracts from this area to some degree, but the building has a lot of potential for sure.
Sounds like the perfect place for industrial craft brewery.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Like there's someone's had the idea. It was used as a courthouse for about 30 years, and so from the 1860s into the 1880s.
How many people can you get in there?
I think when we come around the corner, you get a sense of the size of the building. I think you could probably get about 75, 100 people in there.
They were trying to raise funds to build that
Okay.
in addition to the building.
Right. So we'll head this way now, just a little bit. Growth was very slow here in the village of Whatcom and its surrounding area. The one big economically productive thing was the Bellingham Bay Improvement Company's coal mine. So that hill up there, that lump of trees you see, Seaholm Hill, was initially used as a coal mine in the 1850s and 1860s. Once the hill was tapped out of coal, it then got logged. Once it was logged, then the owners passed it over to the territory to open up the normal school there that eventually evolved into Western Washington State College and Western Washington University. The coal mine there was run by a man named Edmund Fitzhugh. Fitzhugh was the Indian agent. He was appointed by the U.S. government to be the guardian to the Lummi people. And the way he saw that role was very paternalistically. He married 2 native women who reputedly hated him a great deal. He also didn't want Lummi people to work. He didn't want them to hire out, even though there was an enormous demand for labor, as was shown by them working at the initial mill. He refused to allow them to hire out. So to find workers for his coal mine, they went all the way to the Olympic Peninsula and recruited a group of Sklallam men from the Sklallam tribe. The leader of those men was a man named Sihon, and his name remains on the hill to this day. It also gave the name to the village that kind of sprouted around that coal elevator that went down the path of what is now Laurel Street and went out to a dock for coal exports. But this area was really focused just on extraction. There was very little refinement. There were logs being taken down and shipped elsewhere. There was coal being taken out of the hills and shipped elsewhere, but not a lot of development in the 1860s, 1870s. Things start to pick up a little bit in the 1880s as that old mill site gets some new use. A group that's called the Washington Colony came from Kansas. They were a group of utopian socialists. They believed in creating a plural, equitable workplace, having plural marriages. They were mostly vegetarians, and they opened up a very successful, though briefly lived, lumber mill in the site of that original one. They also built the dock, the Colony Wharf, the name's on it to this day. They succeeded where the men before them never had. They actually sold boards down in San Francisco. But they didn't last too long because one of the men who was an investor in the Bellingham Bay Improvement Company, when they gave it over, he kind of cashed out his shares when they gave it over to the normal school, and that man, J.J. Donovan, started a new modern hydroelectric mill up at Lake Whatcom. So the mill down here on the creek was direct drive. The creek turned the water wheel turns the saw. You can run as long as the creek is flowing. Up at Lake Whatcom, they created a mill pond and a hydroelectric mill that could run 24/7, 365. And that very quickly, that Liddell Donovan mill put the Colony Mill out of business. It also led to a lot of growth here along the waterfront that we're going to start seeing as we head along here. So very quickly, in the late 1880s, the area starts to pick up in a number of different ways. So we'll make a few small stops as we start heading along the waterfront. Any questions before we do?
Help me with hydroelectric. I mean, how early in history was that?
So it's they started the mill in about 1895, and it was pretty cutting edge technology, but was kind of the direction that industrial mills had gone in, was to create a steady supply of water through a dam, and then to do that to power a larger system rather than that direct drive.
So when was this area built?
1911.
What was the question?
When was this area filled and paved was 1911. And so until that time, this area would have been the tidal flat. There was a wooden walkway that kind of went along about level with the courthouse. And so there was a wooden pathway that kind of went right along the sort of above low tide, but right where high tide lapped up to, which is kind of just as the hill starts to pick up. So we'll head this way. The Great Northern Railroad is going to come to the finest deep water port in the Pacific Northwest. And if you know anything about the cities of the Northwest, there are different boosters and everyone thinks their town is the best. A lot of people thought Bellingham Bay would be the terminus. And so in the 1880s, early 1880s, we see a huge building boom in what is now the Fairhaven area. Hundreds of Chinese laborers are brought in to rapidly construct a downtown to be the terminus of a railroad that never arrived here and instead went to Tacoma, and Fairhaven was out of luck, leading to a really quick decline here, a lot of disappointment. Fairhaven would stick around as a rival to these villages to the north, Whatcom, Seaholm, and eventually a fourth village in between them called Bellingham. That's in the area of what's now Boulevard Park. These four villages, all separate at the beginning of the 1890s, are all kind of vying for the boom that seems to always be just out of reach. And so growth is somewhat elusive and it's cyclical, right? There's a big boom 1883 into 1885. But by September of that year, residents were circulating what they called the Chinese deadline. They said by the end of the construction season, everyone of Chinese descent needs to be out. And we won't let them stay here, we won't let them work for us, and we won't buy anything from them. Okay, so we start to see really quickly, right? Remember, this is all in one relatively young person's lifespan, that in 1852, these two men show up and have to negotiate for their presence here, and they're told you're welcome here as long as you're a good passenger, as long as you don't rock the boat, try to seize the paddle. And we can see already, just 33 years later, people being evicted, saying you don't belong here, you can't live here. Okay, and that's not going to be, unfortunately, the last eviction we see. We'll head a little further down the line. Railroad. We start to see two big industries pop up here on the waterfront. Anybody know what were the two big industries down here? Canneries, so salmon canneries, and shingles. Shingles, cedar shingles, the shakes that people put on their roofs all over this country were produced here in Bellingham. So Bellingham was home to the largest salmon cannery in North America and the largest shingle mill in North America, finishing that wood down here at the waterfront. So up at Lake Whatcom, they process the big logs, they send them down the hill. Here they're finished, turned into boards, turned into shingles. And that salmon that comes in, most of it coming down from Alaska in this huge fishing fleet, is canned here. At a time before tuna was the canned fish of choice. So this area starts becoming really industrial in the 1880s and into the 1890s. The towns of the villages of Whatcom and Seaholm merge and build this city hall for New Whatcom in 1892. Around that same time, the villages of Bellingham and Fairhaven merge into Fairhaven, and the showdown is set between New Whatcom and Fairhaven for who will consume the other. Down here on the waterfront, there's again a huge demand for labor, and that demand for labor again overlooks local native people and focuses much further afield. So we start to see a growth of labor coming from around the world. A lot of Norwegians and Swedes, people coming from Nordic countries. Also a lot of Slavs coming from coming from Croatia and the area of what's formerly Yugoslavia. We also see a lot of labor coming over from Asia. Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and South Asian labor coming to work here. We see people coming from the Northeast and from California. People coming from really all the four corners of the world to work in this booming industrial waterfront. That industrial waterfront has had its heyday, okay, and in some ways is in a big moment of transition. So in our next few stops, we're going to kind of see three different phases of that waterfront realignment. This is the first phase behind us. The former site of Bellingham Sash and Door, kind of like a local Home Depot. And this site is currently owned by the city. It's in need of remediation. There's a lot of dirty stuff in the soil. A lot of work needs to be done. It's in the most protean stage, okay? And so what we're gonna do is we're gonna walk past that and we're gonna walk towards Maritime Heritage Park, and we can see a kind of completed stage in that redevelopment, that realignment. And then we'll finish up top on the hill looking at the former Georgia Pacific site that's somewhere in between this and Maritime right now, okay? Along the way, we'll make a couple brief little stops there. Any questions before we go?
Yes, are they working on rehabilitating?
Not yet. No, there's no work being done to rehabilitate this yet. It's mostly used as a parking lot for DPW for some of the bigger projects down here. But as soon as the other waterfront project is done, is pretty high, I think, in the potential area. But there's currently, again, it's at that kind of the most basic protein level. There's a long way to go on this site. And so it looks pretty dismal right now, but one should remember that that's what beautiful Maritime Heritage Park looked like in the 70s, okay? And it didn't take until now to make it beautiful either.
I know the shrimp.
So we'll head this way. So here we cross back over Whatcom Creek. And you can get a little bit of a sense of the falls up there that has drawn a lot of attention to this area over the years. You can also see that this area of the creek, through a tremendous amount of effort, has been restored to a much more natural state. If you go along Whatcom Creek further up, around, say, Iowa Street, behind those car dealerships, you'll see that the banks are straight. And the banks are channeled with riprap, this rock that's kind of in cages, that makes for good flood control, it makes for an economical use of area, and it makes for very few salmon. Salmon like a bank with grasses that's uneven, that has a natural bend, that has trees that overhang it. And so the restoration of this bank has been a slow process. Whatcom Creek was an industrial dumpway, an untreated sewage mess pit, and it really needed a lot of work to come back to this level. The hatchery here and the restoration of the creek means that this November, if you come here, you'll see all along that fence on that wall lined with people, as the creek will be teeming with fish. Now the fish can't get up very far, the run is not entirely natural or restored in any ways, but you're going to see fish, you're going to see birds, you're going to see marine mammals, you're going to see life coming back to the creek. And so we want to remember that the damage that has been done can be undone, can be turned back, and we can do a lot if we commit and have the will, and if we want to see this creek come back to life. So you can see, if we look out this way, the Whatcom Creek Waterway. In 1911, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers dredged this area to create a deep water containerized port here. For almost 100 years, big ships loaded and unloaded here. Starting in the early 2000s, we see a real big drawdown in the port traffic. It's in part because the aluminum smelter, the Intalco plant, stops receiving large shipments through here, and then a few years later, the Georgia Pacific paper mill shuts down. This has motivated this big transition. We're not a big industrial port anymore. There's still activity, a lot of work happening down here, but the volume of container traffic is gone. And so we're adjusting and figuring out what it means to have this waterfront and how we can best use it. And so that's a process that I'm sure a lot of you are involved in already, but I encourage everybody to pay attention to and get involved in. So we're gonna head up past Maritime Heritage Park. Make sure you take a look at how beautiful it is and how beautiful other places could be. And then we're gonna cross Holly Street, and it's gonna be a little hectic, but I think it'll be all right. All right, come with me. So you can see behind us here the ongoing waterfront renewal project there. And right now they're laying in these two roads Granary Ave and the Laurel Street extension will eventually allow a lot more access to this site. You can see the 6 digester eggs where the wood pulp used to sit and be bleached. When we go a little further up the hill, you'll be able to see the acid ball where the was acidified. The pulp would be acidified. This big building up front, the white building, was the first part of the waterfront renewal. So that building that's called the Granary, even though it never held green, is the first part of the project that hopefully is going to invite a lot more people in there. Just a few years ago, that was pretty decrepit. There were no windows, the outside was peeling, it was falling apart. So that Granary building was originally built as a chicken egg storage facility for the Whatcom Farmers Co-op. That was founded around 1920 and grew into a really, really large co-op. They made an incredible amount of dried egg product for U.S. troops during World War II, and it was a really large, successful farmers co-op. Unfortunately, in the post-World War II era, paranoia about communism was especially high in this area, and co-ops came under suspicion of being too communistic. And so the co-op owners were encouraged to sell out to one of the farmers who very rapidly mismanaged the co-op into ruin and had to sell the granary in the 50s to Georgia Pacific, who had opened a giant paper facility here. That facility defined Bellingham's waterfront for about 80 years, did an enormous amount of damage to the natural environment, and was sold to the city for $1 and kind of left in the city's hands to do what they can with it. And so the southern end of the site is where all of the kind of polluted topsoil has been scraped up to, and this end of the site is being redeveloped more and more for public access. It's another opportunity to get involved, even though a lot of things have been decided about it, a lot of things are still up in the air. And the Port Commission is a great place to get involved if you want to have more of a say in it. In the meantime, thinking about our main timeline here, in the early 20th century, this area in general was booming rapidly, and that industrialization was leading to that work front, again drawing workers from all over the world and giving this area down here in New Whatcom a really vibrant life. It was a place where, because the factories ran 24 hours a day, there were 3 shifts of workers that got out and hit the streets every day. And so this whole area was lined with businesses that catered to these communities. A lot of different immigrant restaurants, a lot of different fraternal organizations like the Sons of Norway. Organizations like the Industrial Workers of the World had offices on this street. One of the few remaining buildings from this era is the Oakland Block, which was constructed in the 1890s. In the early 20th century, it was also home to Whatcom County's first black-owned business. And so out of that building, a restaurant called the High Flyer, or the Mobile, was run by an African-American family for about 4 or 5 years. Somewhere in between 1900 and 1910, they were running it. We also see people, again, from all over the world in this area, but we see growing tensions around the identity of this place and growing fears about the sort of power of white supremacy to stay in control here. And so we're going to talk a little further up the road about a really major event in that history. We're going to go up and cross back over Holly, all right? And so be careful again as we do that. And you can also take note as we go up right before we cross, there's a marker. If you've ever been in downtown Bellingham and wondered, hey, why is my road like turning 45 degrees? That's because of our multiple road grids, our 4 different grids that were laid down here, and them all crashing together, right? In 1892, we see that New Whatcom was formed, right? The merger of old Whatcom and Seaholm. And I said Bellingham and Fairhaven and merged into Fairhaven. Well, in 1904, they finally decide, you know what? This whole two cities, two city halls, two administrations, it's silly. Let's get together and merge. But Fairhaven says, I don't want to be Whatcom, and Whatcom says, I don't want to be Fairhaven. So they compromise, and they pick that old village of Bellingham, the name that George Vancouver had given to this bay, and they apply that to their new city when they conglomerate all those 4 villages into the city we know today. So we'll head up the hill.
Josh,
Yeah.
and a lot of you probably noticed in the Old Town Cafe, which I think was the restaurant, that same place was
Yeah.
like, there's a picture on the wall
Right.
in there of a couple of black people standing out front who were probably the owners.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah.
ever, the next time you stand in line waiting to eat,
Yeah.
and if you ask them about it, they'll point it out to you. But yeah.
Yeah, and so next time you're in the, yeah, and they've got a couple other old pictures of the construction, yeah, and one of them. So keep your eyes open.
Well, I think it was Vancouver who named it, and I named it. You probably didn't.
Yeah, you really liked it, right?
Yeah.
So this was the line between Whatcom and Seaholm. Keeps the creek all in Whatcom, and then you know you're in Seaholm when you're in any of the streets that follow the alphabetical pattern they laid down. So not all of the streets remain to this day, but counting back from the top of the alphabet, let's see if I can do it. It goes Pasco, Otis, Newell, Mason, Liberty, Key, Jersey, Billy Frank, which was formerly Indian, then High Street, Garden Street, Forest, State was originally Dock, and then Cornwall, Bay, and then Army Street, which was never constructed, that would have been here. And so that's the Seaholm pattern. It crashes into the Whatcom pattern here, giving us this kind of angled turn.
A Street, B Street, C Street is Whatcom.
Yes, yeah, so the lettered streets are the Whatcom streets. All right, we're gonna head across the road. So this will be our last big stop on the tour. Maybe not time. And we stop here for a couple reasons. One, this building, again built in the early 1890s as the new Whatcom City Hall out of Chuckanut sandstone and locally produced bricks. They didn't have to come even from San Francisco anymore. We've got our own brickyards over by Squalicum Creek. This building here serves as City Hall until the new one is built and opens around 1940, and then it becomes the Museum of History and Art. So it's a place where the way in which Bellingham and Whatcom County perceives itself and perceives its history is shared with the world. And that's a story that we always need to be thinking about and questioning and revising. This is also a really significant site because, in addition to being City Hall, the basement of this building was the jail for a number of decades. And in 1907, it became a really significant site because of a Labor Day rally held by a group called the Asiatic Exclusion League. They had an early September Labor Day rally. They got the men who arrived a little drunk, a little angry with these stories about a dusky peril, and that the idea that men that they called Hindus, even though most of them weren't Hindu, most of them were from the Punjab and followed the Sikh religion, that they were working in those board mills, in those finishing mills at the waterfront, a few hundred of them. And the Asiatic Exclusion League said they're going to keep coming, and they're going to take your jobs. And so those men went to the lettered streets, to the boarding houses where those Sikh or Punjabi men lived, and they arrested them out. And there was a riot, a pogrom, an attack on these men. The city officials kind of put their hands up. They said, there's nothing we can do. We can just put you in the jail for the night. And the only place we can keep you safe is under lock and key. And so many of those men spent the night in the basement, in the jail, crammed in shoulder to shoulder, before the next morning being fired out of town, being sent out. And thus begins or marks another important in this process of changing Bellingham, of making Bellingham a place where white people think that only white people are welcome and allowed. So we see after the Chinese exclusion of 1885, the South Asian exclusion of 1907, in 1942, a dozen Japanese and Japanese American families here in Whatcom County are taken and are sent off to a camp in Minidoka up in Idaho. Their farms are seized and sold without their profit, and they, for the most part, as far as we can tell, don't return to Bellingham. At the close of World War II, the canneries, Pacific American fisheries shuts down. Most of the Filipino families that remained in town then left at that point. And we see, by 1950, a very, very white Bellingham. In fact, a 99% white Bellingham. Okay? And a city that's so white that when the famous singer, black singer Marian Anderson comes to town to give a concert, she can perform, but she can't spend the night. She has to go back to Seattle to find a hotel in which she can stay. 1950 Bellingham, 99% white. We know from the start of this tour, 1850 Bellingham, 0% white. So in 100 years, a process happened. A process that if it happened anywhere else in the world, we would acknowledge was ethnic cleansing. Okay, a process where very rapidly white people came as guests, as visitors, and were very bad guests and very bad visitors, right? Seized that paddle, rocked the boat, decided really quickly that people who look like me are in charge here, and only people like me belong here. Now we've started to see that change a little bit, but not everyone is comfortable with that change. And a lot of people express that in a lot of different ways. Sometimes standing right against the change, other times asking or demanding that it slow down, standing in the way of it in a lot of different ways. What I take from this history is that even though a lot of really awful things happened here, we can see that level of transformation and how rapidly things can transform. For the worse, sure, in many ways. But we know then that things can transform that rapidly for the better if we put our hearts and minds and feet behind it. And if we make the effort to think about what it means to be somebody who arrived here without a paddle, someone who's a guest, someone who needs to take the lead of indigenous people. For those of us like me who are white here, to think about what it means to be in a place where your presence was preceded by all this exclusion, where if you feel welcome and comfortable here, you have a responsibility to acknowledge why some other people might not feel welcome and comfortable here. This is the point at which we wrap up the kind of formal tour. I'll take any questions we have. I'll kind of walk us back towards where we started before we break off. And if there are any questions you don't get answered here, you can, or anything that comes up after, you can always go through Kay, who has my contact info and can get at me. So are there any questions about anything from the tour? Yeah, Donald.
What happened to the Chinese and then the Sikhs who were expelled? Did they go elsewhere on the West Coast?
Yeah, so in the case of the Chinese people who left in 1885, it's a little hard to say for sure exactly where they went, though a number presumably went down to Seattle and Tacoma, which retained. They did, but there was always a population that stayed in both of those cities. In the case of the South Asian men, there was kind of with the Chinese exclusion, it happened over a longer period. so it's a little harder to track. With those South Asian men, we know at least some of them ended up down in Yuma, Arizona, in another Sikh community. Some of them went to Everett, because there was later another riot in which some of them were targeted. But most of them probably went north back to BC, where they had migrated here from.
And there was no Insurrection Act against.
No, so in BC they had, starting in 1911, they didn't allow any more Asian migration, but up until that point, nobody who had already got there was expelled, but if they left, they couldn't get back in. And so it would, for a lot of them, who, a lot of these men were sojourners who they were born in the Punjab, then they worked as policemen in Hong Kong for the British Empire, and then they would come to BC, and that was a kind of like a series of step-ups in your economic kind of potential that a lot of them took, was to take a job as a policeman in Hong Kong and then use that to get passage to Vancouver, and then some of them came down to the States, but they had an even harder time down here.
Did these men come with families?
So in the case of almost all of the Asian migrants that come here, almost all are men. Even before, so the United States passes the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. In 1875, they passed something called the Page Act that banned Chinese women, and they interpreted Chinese very broadly from coming to the United States. And so even before they were really cracking down on the immigration of male labor migrants, they had already attempted to totally freeze out any women from migrating. And that's in part because in the 14th Amendment says that if a child is born within the borders of the United States, that child is an American citizen. And that was done as a kind of workaround to in-citizenize African Americans, formerly enslaved African Americans, but it led to the idea that then Asian people would have a route to citizenship because they weren't allowed to go through the normal naturalization process, but birthright citizenship is universal. All right, so I will kind of walk us back towards where we started, and if you have any other questions, ask them along the way, but thank you to Kay for putting this together, and all of you for coming out. Thanks, everybody.